Welcome back to Terminal Talk. Today, we're unpacking the massive 2025 breakthroughs in GDDR6 vulnerabilities. Specifically, we're looking at how security researchers have successfully migrated Rowhammer attacks out of standard CPU memory and right into the highly parallelized, high-speed world of discrete GPUs. Now, if you're a red teamer or a hardware security engineer, you already know that breaching VRAM isolation is pretty much the holy grail of modern exploitation. It's what everyone is after. So in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how two groundbreaking exploits, GDDRHammer and GeForge, managed to actually pull this off. Okay, let's dive into this highly structured, expert-to-expert technical breakdown. We'll kick things off with the physical foundations of the silicon, move up the stack to the software attack mechanics, examine the actual memory isolation bypass, and then wrap it all up with a comparative analysis of both exploits. Section 1. Physical foundations, silicon and electrical anomalies. Let's get grounded in the exact bare metal hardware mechanics making this possible. To make sure we're speaking precisely and using the established engineering terminology, let's briefly define our baseline. Rowhammer, which we've known about since back in 2014, fundamentally exploits the physical proximity of memory cells. By rapidly and repeatedly accessing or hammering specific aggressor rows, attackers generate electrical interference. That interference leaks into adjacent victim rows and forces their bits to flip. To mitigate this, memory controllers rely on target row refresh, or TRR. TRR acts as your primary defensive countermeasure. The moment it detects rapid access to a specific row crossing a set threshold, it preemptively refreshes the adjacent rows, successfully discharging that accumulated interference before any bits can actually flip. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why GPUs completely upend the traditional threat model. You see, on a CPU, Rowhammer relies on sequential execution. Even when you're using multi-threading, the access rate is still relatively slow, which gives the TRR mechanism plenty of time to intervene. But a GPU? A GPU is built entirely on massive parallelism. We're talking about thousands of concurrent threads, or warps in NVIDIA's architecture. When thousands of threads simultaneously hammer those same aggressor rows, they create an absolute avalanche of requests. The GDDR6 memory controller and its TRR mitigations simply cannot process the refresh commands fast enough. It's literally the hardware equivalent of bringing a bucket to a tsunami. The physical limits of the silicon are just entirely overwhelmed by parallel software execution. Moving right along to Section 2, Attack Mechanics, Software, and Execution Layer. Let's shift our focus up the abstraction stack to see how attackers actually execute these physical anomalies using software. The initial GPU hammer attack established a highly specific three-stage methodology to get this done. Step 1. The researchers had to reverse engineer the proprietary NVIDIA driver to figure out the function mapping virtual memory to the physical GDDR6 banks. You have to know exactly where your aggressor rows are before you start. Step 2, they deployed a specialized CUDA kernel to launch that massive parallel request avalanche we just talked about. And finally, step 3 is synchronization. They perfectly timed the hammering to begin the exact millisecond after the memory controller naturally refreshed the rows. Why? Because that ensures the electrical interference accumulates for the absolute maximum time possible before the controller's next scheduled refresh. But the real game-changing breakthrough came a bit later with GDDRHammer, which introduced a devastating technique known as memory massaging. Instead of just hammering the silicon and crossing their fingers, memory massaging actively shapes the battlefield. It overcomes TRR by shifting critical data structures into areas of VRAM that are inherently more vulnerable to electrical interference, maybe spots where cell density propagates that interference better. And the wild part? It does this blindly. It identifies vulnerable regions using timing analysis without even needing direct memory map access. It exploits standard allocation functions, like your everyday CUDA malloc, to push and pull data until the target structures are sitting right in the crosshairs. 129. That right there is the average number of bit flips per bank researchers managed to achieve on the professional-grade RTX A6000. That's the sheer multiplier effect of combining memory massaging with massive GPU parallelism. It takes an exploit that historically relied on pure statistical luck, hoping you'd get maybe one or two random flips, and transforms it completely. At 129 flips per bank, breaking memory isolation is absolutely no longer a game of roulette. It is a highly predictable, repeatable engineering task. Let's look at Section 3, Memory Isolation Bypass, Payload Execution. We're going to escalate the narrative to the payload phase and demonstrate the truly devastating kernel-level impact of these predictable bit flips. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is understanding why 129-bit flips constitute such a critical threat. What exactly are those flips targeting that turns them into a full system compromise? Well, it all comes down to GPU page tables. Just like a CPU, your GPU uses page tables to map virtual addresses over to physical chunks of VRAM. Every single entry in those tables contains physical page addresses, along with specific access permissions. By utilizing the memory massaging technique we went over, attackers can precisely align a page table entry directly with a vulnerable row. Then the hammering starts. If the attacker can flip just one most significant bit, say flipping a 0 to a 1 in the physical address, that pointer no longer points to your safe, isolated sandbox. It shifts, sometimes by gigabytes. All of a sudden, an unprivileged CUDA application is pointing directly at memory owned by an entirely different process, or worse, straight at the underlying NVIDIA driver's core management structures. But here's the kicker. The attackers didn't stop at the edge of the VRAM. Modern systems rely heavily on unified memory architectures, which means the GPU can talk directly to the CPU's system RAM via direct memory access, or DMA. Because of this architecture, certain GPU page tables inherently contain entries that point outward to system RAM. By meticulously forcing bit flips in these specific page table entries, GDDRHammer modifies the pointer to redirect an attacker's VRAM address straight into the CPU's main memory. You are effectively using a malicious, parallelized CUDA kernel to bridge the gap and escape VRAM entirely. If your security posture relied on the GPU being a perfectly sandboxed environment, well, that perimeter is completely gone. So the crucial point is captured perfectly by security researcher Andrew Kwong. He notes, "We demonstrate how an attacker can induce a bit flip on the GPU to gain read and write access to the entire CPU memory, which completely compromises the machine." Think about the severity of that. You can extract encryption keys, scrape credentials, or even modify the core OS kernel itself, all initiated from code running on a discrete graphics card. Section 4, Comparative Analysis, GDDRHammer versus GeForce. Let's conclude our technical deep dive by looking at the actual hardware benchmarks and introducing a parallel exploit. So, while GDDRHammer intensely focuses on corrupting the page tables themselves, there was actually another exploit developed concurrently called GeForge. Now, GeForge scopes things differently. It targets the page directory. This is the higher-level structural component that actually points down to the page tables. By corrupting the directory instead of individual tables, an attacker can theoretically compromise a massive contiguous range of page tables all at once. This drastically increases the blast radius and the efficiency of the attack. Let's move to and see how this builds when we systematically contrast the efficiency of both these exploits across consumer and professional tier hardware. GDDRHammer hit 129 flips per bank on the professional A6000. But look at GeForce when run on a consumer-grade RTX 3060, an absolutely staggering 1,171 flips per bank. Even when aimed at the professional A6000, GeForce still managed to achieve 202 flips per bank. The bottom line here is that both of these exploits easily cross the threshold of viability, weaponizing random physical anomalies with terrifying precision. This stark discrepancy in GeForce's performance, going from over 1,000 flips down to around 200, is driven entirely by the hardware architecture itself. That nearly six-fold drop in efficiency on the A6000 is due to the inherent differences in professional-grade memory. You've got tighter manufacturing tolerances and completely different chip layouts on the A6000 that help mitigate the electrical interference. But crucially, they do not eliminate it. The core vulnerability persists across the entire product stack, from your home gaming rig right up to enterprise data centers. What's really notable about this current generation of attacks is how the information was disclosed. In academia and vulnerability research, being the first to publish is generally everything. But in a very rare move, the independent research teams behind GDDRHammer and GeForge discovered they were running on parallel tracks and actually decided to collaborate. By co-publishing, they combined their methodologies, which delivered a far more robust, undeniable wake-up call to the entire hardware security field. All of which leaves senior engineers and architects with a critical dilemma. We have spent decades building up secure enclaves, hypervisors, and kernel isolation mechanisms on the CPU. But if unified memory architectures inherently expose system RAM to GPU hardware anomalies via DMA, then that defensive perimeter is fundamentally porous. So I want to leave you with this provocative question to think about. If unified memory architectures inherently expose CPU RAM to GPU hardware anomalies, how can future silicon genuinely isolate critical system kernels? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Until next time.